All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. This is the fourth event in our Mitigating Bias and Analytics series that we are doing with Tableau. If you've been with us before, welcome back. If this is one of your first events with us, thanks for being here. We're really excited about this session. Today, we are super fortunate to have Noelle Silver join us talking about algorithms and all the complexity around building and evaluating algorithms and what that process looks like. So she's going to be talking about some of those topics, and then we will have time for Q&A at the end. So as you start to think of questions, throw them in the Q&A section, and we will definitely get to them at the end. So with that, let's go over the agenda real quick. I'm going to do some intros of our organization and Tableau, then we'll get into the good stuff. And then, like I said, we will leave some time for Q&A at the end. And then finally, we'll close things out, show you how to get to the recording of this webinar so you can let your colleagues know about this discussion. And then we will have an optional networking event right after this. So the email that you got about 10 minutes before this started had the link to the networking event. In addition to that, I will post it at the end as well. So a little bit about this series. Women in Analytics hosts a webinar series, and we do it by topic. So this topic is Mitigating Bias in Analytics, which is, again, a free virtual series featuring panel discussions and fireside chats, discussing ways to identify and mitigate bias throughout the analytic process. So our first couple of episodes in this series covered design, data collection, and the last one was around policies and standards. And so those are all up on our YouTube channel if you want to kind of catch up to the series. And a little bit about Women in Analytics. So we're an organization to help increase visibility to women making an impact in the analytics space. We just launched a new membership platform. So if you're interested in staying engaged with us, feel free to check that out at womeninanalytics.com. And I'm going to pass things over for a second to Lilia, who is our partner from Tableau.
Hi, thank you so much. So just real quick, want to say thank you for letting us be a part of this at Tableau. My job is really exciting and get to work on our women's in leadership programs and our Data Plus Diversity program. So I was really excited about this opportunity to partner on such an important topic. We also have other things going on our side of the house. So in addition to partnering with this webinar series, we are also leading a Women Leading Through Change series that is more personal and professional development. And I'm excited to announce that we're hosting Alicia Garza, who is the founder of Black Futures Lab and co-creator of the Black Lives Matter global movement on September 24th. So we will include that link in your follow-up email after this event, or you can head on over to tableau.com/Alicia-Garza. If you're not familiar with Tableau, we help you see and understand your data, and Tableau, what I love about it, it's for everybody. And so it works really nicely with the topics that are going to be talked about today. And we're really excited to be able to support in this way and excited to hear from you, Noelle. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Lilia. Yeah, we're super happy to have our partner Tableau throughout this series. It's been a really wonderful partnership. So thank you again for everything you've done to support it. Some webinar tips: if you're having audio issues, then you definitely can't hear me right now, but go ahead and email us at info@womeninanalytics.com. We'll help you out. Like I said, if you have questions, feel free to fire away throughout the entire webinar, and we will definitely get to them towards the end. And then if you're up for some networking afterwards and you want to talk to other people who are attending this webinar as well about some of the topics that Noelle's going to cover, I highly recommend you stick around for about 20 minutes afterwards and participate. It has been a really fun, engaging session just to kind of connect with other people and meet other people who care about this topic. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. So Noelle is a multi-award-winning technologist who specializes in conversational AI and voice technology, intelligent apps and agents, and responsible AI practices. She has led teams at NPR, Microsoft, and Amazon, and is the founder of #Love Influencers and the AI Leadership Institute. She is passionate about mindful leadership, authentic personal branding, and the ethical and responsible use of technology in business. She is currently head of instruction at head of instruction, data science, analytics, and full stack development at HackerU, where she works with universities and leads a team of engineers to create innovative tech education programs to empower learners to get started with their career in the tech industry. Noelle, thank you so much for being here. I'm a huge, huge fan of yours, and I'm really, really excited about the topic you're going to cover today.
Thank you so much. I am excited too. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you all can take a look at. I always like to start my talks with a little bit about me. And this is a quick one because I do think a huge amount of this value will be not only in the Q&A right after what I say, but also in our networking session. So I just want to say first, thank you to Women in Analytics. I remember when this was like born, or at least in the early stages. So excited to see the growth of the group and how valuable it is that you open it up for someone like me, who is often the talker, to get to actually hear other people talk in the same meeting. So I think it's awesome. I'm super excited about the networking part. So if you weren't planning on staying, I hope you will now, because that is such a it's just really delightful for me to be able to get to know the community instead of it just being one way. So I love that about this event, and I'm just really grateful that you asked me to be a part of it. And I hope you all will find something interesting, meaningful, and maybe even something new that you hadn't thought of before throughout. But this is me. This was actually just a little bit of me to give you an idea of why I do what I do, and what it may seem like I do a lot of things, but I have a lot of passion and a lot of energy. And so it's the right amount for me. But this is my family. I have 4 children. My dad lives with me. You can see him here. And my son, Max. And really these people, they're my humans. I basically take care of them. But more importantly, because I'm a technologist, I see through their eyes how technology could change their life, make it better, more accessible. And unfortunately, we've got certain practices, habits, if you will, in the way that we build technology, that we don't actually ask their opinion or get their input or are empathetic to their needs when we build software. And so part of that is my lens upon which I see bias through. And I think it's important that you know that, so that you have some context to why I think the way that I do. But I also am very much evolving my thinking about all the things all the time. And I encourage you, as you hear what I say, to just kind of hear it openly and just as an idea, and be willing to kind of embrace the idea and then make a decision about whether or not that's an idea you want to also embrace. But don't make that decision right away. Just kind of take it in, let it sit with you, and certainly ask questions. I'd be happy to share with you. I have a long career of examples. Ooh, questions already. I'm just gonna keep my little chat. Okay, so I wanted to just share with you. Oh, is there? Oh yeah, it's my, thank you. Oh, look, there's my dad. Thanks for that. Yeah, so that's my dad now. You can see him. I had some Zoom window with my chat feature right over my pictures. Anyway, so that's them. It is my why. I think it's important to have a strong why. But I also wanted to share with you that the last year has really been pretty eventful for me. I've had a bunch of awards and just like a collection of really cool things happen. But the reason that this happened was because I had the courage to start talking about what I thought. Many of us, especially as engineers, go through a practice or do something at work and we're like, that's not right. I don't feel good about that. Or that's an amazing idea. I wish more people knew. But then it kind of just sits with us. So part of my message to you today is I am not special or unique. I am just an engineer that sat on some pretty cool teams. And I'm sharing this with you, but I think that's where the magic is as soon as we actually as individuals start sharing our story, start sharing our experiences, our funny stories, our sad stories, our triumphs, our challenges, that we learn way more from each other, not only through empathy and understanding each other's perspective, but also just getting ideas that we wouldn't have thought of because, not everyone has a dad to take care of or 4 kids, or my son Max has Down syndrome. Like not everyone has those experiences. So being able to see the world through my eyes has helped some people, and I hope it'll be helpful to you too. So usually what I try to do is, is get started with just a quick quote. And this, you'll see why. It sets the context for kind of the rest of the talk. And this, I have a couple windows open, so I'm trying to make sure you guys can see it all. So this is a poet, a couple different poets worked on this together, but I'll just read it to you and you can read it along with me. What is success? To laugh often and much, to win the respect of intelligent people and the affection of children, to earn the appreciation of honest critics and endure the betrayal of false friends, to appreciate the beauty, to find the best in others, to leave the world a bit better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, or a redeemed social condition. To know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived, this is to have succeeded. Now, this quote was actually introduced to me multiple times in my career, and all by the executives within the companies that I worked for. And over the years, it's become much more easier for me to understand why this quote is important to them. Because we all, as we start working on things, can dive into the details and talk about tactics and, you know, the very specific things that we can do. But having this kind of grand idea about how you can make an impact, and that ultimately that impact could be one life, but that life could end up doing incredible things, that it's really important to understand how you're measuring success. Jeff Bezos was the one most recently that had said he had it on his fridge and wanted his kids to know, you know, that these were the metrics by which he was measuring his team family, which I thought was really funny. The other interesting thing is that Ralph Waldo Emerson made this quote popular, but actually it was a woman, Bessie Anderson Stanley, who wrote it. And for a long time, I quoted this quote as if it was just Ralph Waldo Emerson's. And eventually someone was like, you should do a little research, which I always encourage us to do, right? Evolve our thinking, do a little research, go figure it out. And I went and found out, oh, this is Bessie's quote. So anyway, now I give them both some credit. So what this all leads to is we are in a time, not just the pandemic time, but we are in a time generationally that we have more technology at our fingertips. We have huge, big companies investing billions of dollars in research and development to create technology on behalf of the world. But that is a huge responsibility, at least in my case. We can use, you know, AI, data science, data analytics. I actually have, you know, I use AI in the sense of this big umbrella of technology. But this technology, it can help a lot of people. But only if we understand, as the creators, as the people building this technology, if we understand what those people need help with. So oftentimes I see, as a data scientist even, I have a pain, like I know my son needs something, or I know my dad needs something, and I drive towards a solution to solve that very specific problem. And I get there, but I don't actually involve like maybe industry professionals or other people within in the world, and break echo chambers of academia and industry and bring them together and say, how could we solve this more holistically? And that's kind of part of why I have these talks, is like, how do we get more people in the room? How do we diversify, right, the table, so that we can hear from everybody? And I love, that's what, you know, I love so far, the series that we've had has done just that, right? It's brought people from different parts of the industry, of academia together to provide you some insight into the world of bias. And so I really like it. And like I said, I'm grateful to be here. So the first thing I wanted to talk to you about was changing DNA. I always battle with changing versus evolving. Really, if you look around, or at least when, I'll be very specific, when I looked around in the teams that I was working on, especially on one of my first AI specific jobs was on the Alexa team. I was an anomaly in that situation, right? I was a double minority, I guess they say, where I was a female, there weren't very many of us on my specific team. And then I was also, of course, Hispanic, and there were very few Hispanics as well. And so I recognized instantly that I was like this lone voice of a certain type of perspective. And I want us to be invited to always take a look around. Even if you are a leader, amazing, you have power to change it. But even if you're not, being a vocal advocate for, shouldn't there be other people at this table? Or where did we get our research, you know, our user data from? Who was involved in that? How can I be a part of it? Changing the DNA of our team is going to be really important. And a lot of that happens in hiring. So I personally have had the glorious, wonderful opportunity to lead the hiring of multiple teams. I built a couple of teams at Amazon. I built a team at Microsoft, and I'm creating a team at HackerU. And in doing this, it is my responsibility as a leader to make sure that I am actively pursuing a symphony of talent. And a symphony, I mean, not just, demographic, like what ethnicity is, diversity of an ethnicity or gender, but all the things, introverts, extroverts, industry experience, life experience, which means that when I interview someone, I don't just interview the functional spec, right? I want to understand, who are you? How do you think? What are your values? Because what I have learned is that when I build AI solutions, the values of my team, whether I mean to or not, show up in that technology. So we need to have a more, dedicated conversation about that. So that's the first thing, is that if you are a leader and you're hiring teams, please take the time to think about what a symphony of talent looks like for your organization. I love that word because I'm an old school cellist, and I love the idea of all of these different talents coming together to make something beautiful. And I do think AI has the capability to do this. But if we just kind of put it on coast and we do the things we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we won't see that change, right? We won't see the technology actually represent what we want. Okay, so next thing, there's a few things I wanted to talk about. The next thing is a little bit more tactical. It's for those of us who are actually doing this work, that are building models. And whether we like it or not, and hopefully you know this, I'm sure you do if you're here, bias, we're human, and humans are biased. And when we build AI, our biases, just like our values, show up in that technology. And so there are some tactics that you can use to at least raise awareness that you're aware that bias will show up, and what can you do to either discover it or even mitigate it. And these are hard questions. If you just Google, right, bias in AI, it's all over the place. As a matter of fact, I did a TikTok video. I know, don't at me. I did a TikTok video, but it's super fun. But I did it on bias. And granted, my audience is not technologists. It's not us. It's not the 1% of the 1%. But most people attributed the bias to the tech, to the software. They did not attribute bias to the engineers that wrote it. They actually couldn't really see the people behind the technology, which is another reason why I'm really a big believer that we need to talk more about what we're building. So transparency is a key feature for me, but quickly I'll tell you something really cool that happened last year is Microsoft created this ruler. It was like a black ruler, and it was called the Golden Rule. And of course it had gold letterings, right? I'm a huge fan of these types of, puns and marketing tools, but it was a golden rule. And on the backside of that rule were 5 principles of ethical AI engineering. And I was like, this is amazing. You just put it up on your wall, or you have it in your pencil container. Yes, I have a pencil container. But the cool thing about that was that it had things like privacy, security, transparency, like all of these terms that would trigger in your mind, am I thinking about this? Am I asking the right question at this stage of the development? Less about the functional work of building a model and more about how are we building it? Why are we building it? Are the right people involved in building it? And I feel like even just that shift of intention at the beginning or even in the middle of a development project is a huge difference from how, at least the projects I've been on how we were doing it. So that's the first one. Inside transparency, though, there's a couple things I wanted to bring your attention to in case you weren't aware of it. And I wrote notes because there's so many things I want to tell you that I have to stay on task if we're going to finish on time. But the first thing was something that I uncovered over the last 5 years or so, which is explainability of our models. So, of course, I would love to hand you the golden ticket or the button that you can press that will say, look, here's your bias. You should fix it. We're not really there yet. There are tools available. I'm not going to promote them, but there are tools available to help. But one thing you can do is just make it easier to see the decisions that your models are making. Because if you can see the decisions that how your model is making decisions, right? If you have explainability in your model, then it's going to be easier for you to identify when those decisions maybe, deviate from the ground truth you're expecting. And this happens all the time. And if you're not watching it, it can sneak up on you because it happens in these micro moments. Another thing is even just like interpretability. Can someone look at your model and understand it? This is another thing. It's kind of like for those of us who were, software engineers, it's kind of like documenting our code, right? Most of us don't like doing it, but when we leave and someone gets our code, they are super grateful if we took a moment to make our code explainable. Otherwise, they ultimately either can't use it or they use it incorrectly or they don't use it to its fullest potential. And that's the same thing that will happen with our AI model. So become an advocate for, right, like the explainability and interpretability of the models that you're creating. And this doesn't even have to be, you don't have to implement a piece of software though. If you go like I use Microsoft because I happen to work at Microsoft when the product was launched. But there, you could just, go online and look at different ways of creating explainability in your model. It doesn't have to be a tool or a piece of software, though that might be helpful from a scaling perspective, but it could just be you documenting it at first. You commenting in your Jupyter notebook, you providing a blog that explains your ideas. So there's lots of different ways to get there. And the most important thing is you can start right now because you could just start talking about what your model's supposed to do and then evaluate that against what it's actually doing. Creating that transparency is going to be key. I think that's all I wanted to say. Okay. Okay. So the next thing that I wanted to talk to you about, and I kind of alluded to it already, is the idea of advocacy. I often say things like, if you see something, say something. So many times, and I mentioned this earlier, I will have an intuitive feeling that something wasn't right, and I will just kind of sit on it and be like, I don't know exactly, but something's not right. And again, being a data-driven person, unless I had data to back up what I was saying, I was very hesitant to even call it out. But in artificial intelligence, in building machine learning models, in data analysis specifically, your intuition might actually tell you things long before you have the data. And if you are in tune with that intuition, you could, it's important to just be self-aware of these feelings of like, I don't feel like this is right. Now, the challenge we have or an opportunity that we have, and which is why I say advocacy is a pillar for me in bias, is we have to, what are we advocating for, right? Are we advocating for, in my mind, I'm advocating for the truth, right? For what the data is actually saying. Not the data, not the story I want to tell, not the story that my product owner said, make sure the data tells this story. Not that that happens. But I want to make sure that I'm an advocate for the truth of that data and that it is my responsibility, my ethical responsibility to make sure that that data is being used in a way, is transparent, is, discloses the way that that model is being used and making decisions in a way that you don't have to have a PhD to understand it. And I feel like that's kind of, hand in hand with transparency. But it's the idea of being transparent about what you're doing, but then that transparency does you no good if no one actually knows you were transparent about it. So it's actually advocating, talking out loud. I always tell people, create a blog if you're a writer and just start blogging about it. I've been able to blog my entire career without divulging company secrets or even telling people what company I worked for. But you can talk about the issues, right? Or the challenges that come into your mind. And so with advocacy, I think it's part of just getting, like, using your voice and your very specific lens on the world of data that you're looking at and giving that as a gift to the world for them to also increase their understanding. So again, you can write a blog, but let's say you're not a good blogger and you're a good talker like me. I talk a lot, I know. And if you're a good talker, you could just do what I'm doing right now. I turned on Periscope and I'm just talking. So you could do that. Or you could record a podcast, which is just audio. Or if you like video, you like getting on Zoom calls, create a YouTube channel like Women in Analytics. Or even offer to be on these kind of programs and share your perspective. We need to diversify the voices, right, of who's doing the work. We have a whole community of women in analytics, but if I look at an engineering team on the whole, I don't see that many. But it would be way better and way easier for someone to get into this field if they saw that we existed and if they saw that they could read someone's blog and be like, oh, oh my gosh, I've had those same questions. I'm so glad I'm not alone in asking that. Maybe I will say something in this meeting, or maybe I'll say something to my leadership. It's amazingly comforting to me when I hear someone say something that I was already thinking, where I'm like, oh, okay. And it almost gives me permission to say the same thing, even though it's uniquely mine and my experience. But I'm now like, all right, I'm not alone in this. And so you'll see me, if you are, in my circle of friends and you connect with me, you'll see I talk about this a lot. But there is tactics that we can use, right? Using tools to provide transparency in our models so that we can actually detect bias as it's happening. And we should know that bias is there. We just have to find it. But building that out in, this kind of explainability model. And then using what was talked about in the last section, like what are the tools within the organization, within our leadership, that we can actually put teeth on that and stop a model from going live when when we get to that point where we're pushing a model into production that has challenges or problems with it, because there's a lot of competing agendas, and we, as the advocates for truth, it is our responsibility to stand up for what this data will be used for and how our models will be used. So that was kind of let's see, let me make sure I'm good. So that was kind of the gist of what I wanted to share. One final thing I want to leave you with as we go into maybe a Q&A section is, as I'm right now in a time in my life where I was trying to figure out what can I do to make the biggest impact. We are building technology for everyone, and not everyone's at the table to build it, right? That's it's just a core problem. As I look at the teams I've been on, and they represent a very specific homogeneous group of people, and I want it to be different. And so the way that I did that, and I just invite you to do a similar introspective exercise, how can you make a difference? And it may not be in your day job, unfortunately. I wish it could, but not all of us can do this for our day job. So in my mind, I was like, oh, what could I do? So one thing I did was I created just a website, a blog, where I would highlight, showcase women in AI. So people like me, or me 5 years ago, or me at 10, 11 years old, I could Google and be like, oh, wow, look at this site with all these people that look like me, right? All these people that there's Hispanic women, Black women, there's all these people that I didn't know were doing this work. And so again, the work of Women in Analytics, Women in AI, all of these groups, in addition to just educating each other and being friends to each other, we are helping people who cannot see themselves here. And we need those perspectives desperately. So I just encourage you, as you're going through the process, that there are tactical things we can do as practitioners to make our models more easily, or to allow us, our work, to more easily identify bias. And I mentioned a couple of those tools. There's lots of other tools as well. Like I said, there's actual products that do this as well. But it's more than that. It's also being willing to kind of stand up and have a voice and articulate that, not just for me, not just for you, us as colleagues, but for people that are up and coming. So what I did recently is I took a huge career jump I've always been in enterprise tech. I worked for IBM, VMware, Red Hat, all these companies, always been in enterprise tech. And I jumped to education because I felt like that was where I could make the biggest difference, that I could help, right? I said my very first thing, change the DNA of engineering teams. How would I do that? Oh, I need to train a whole generation of engineers who think ethics first, who think empathy, who think inclusion, who make that, that's part of the way they build their software, part of the way they do their analysis. And that was what I chose. So now I work at HackerU, and I'm building these programs for universities to gather, and not just people right out of college or out of high school, but like anyone, someone who's in retail who wants to become part of the industry. Come on in, let me make it easier for you, right? And that's part of, again, where it's like an extra benefit of your transparency and your ability to create a model that's understandable, is that people who are not natively, in this world will find it welcoming and will be able to understand what's being done and then be able to evolve it. I think a lot of the best ideas in data science don't come from, mathematical analysis. It comes from real world people mapping their problems to this space. And so the more real world people we have trying to solve these problems, I think the better off we are. So anyway, so that's me in a nutshell. I think that's about my 20-minute time period, give or take a minute or two. So maybe we could open it up for questions. Maybe.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Noelle. And I absolutely loved how you, I think a lot of data scientists are probably sitting here thinking like, what can I technically do in my day to day from like a modeling perspective? Like, tell me the steps in my model building process, deployment process that I can do to fix this problem. And I love that you mentioned that, but then you also add this other lens and other dimension to that too, which is not just, it's not just in the specific codes and comments in your codes and exposing bias on a dashboard and presenting that to leadership. It's all of these other kind of more intangible pieces of kind of changing the culture of the environment that you're in.
Yes. I mean, I also had all these notes about what I wanted to talk about adding preprocessors. And like, there are things like tactical things you can build, right? That you inject into the way you're building a model. And I hope I was able to convey those are not the hardest things. The harder thing is like, if you do that, right, then what happens? Who hears that? Who sees that? How do we change the way we operate? But I did, yeah. So I'll actually throw my notes into maybe on Twitter or something so you guys can go and take a look at them. But yeah, I also was thinking about, like, I went through and looked at the way that we were building models at Alexa, for example, and wished that I had the insight back then that I have now, knowing what we built and knowing the challenges of facial recognition and image recognition with bias. I was like, man, what would I have done if I could have built, in the data collection phase, right, some kind of pre-processing that would have checked for bias way early, and then also rechecked for that later in, the model development process, and also post-processing, right before we inject it into a model or ingest it or use it to train a model, or when we do our data splitting, right? There's these micro moments where we can, if we have an explainable model, we should be able to go, all right, I understand why we're making this decision here, and I can see how we've mitigated the bias. But yeah, I did have, you try to talk about all the things, but anyway.
No, I love that. No, that's amazing. I mean, like to that point, it really kind of boils down, maybe a first step that data scientists can take is like, what does it mean to my company for a model to be high enough quality to use it?
Yes. Yeah, I had been talking to a group of women in this space, and we were talking about how do we use AI to even help us do this, right? How do we create like a fairness classifier or a bias classifier? I mean, this is pretty simple. We know what we don't want, right? Like, if the last 90% of your decisions were this type of decision, what's happening? One thing at NPR, for example, when you go to NPR and you're listening to, binge listening to a series of podcasts, one of the mission of NPR is to create a more informed America. And so one of the principles we had to have was, okay, our job is to create an AI model that makes sure it surfaces to you things that are not the binge things that you want to watch, right? Like, every so often we need to say, hey, diversify your listening. Watch this thing you'd never listen to. Listen to this person that you probably don't agree with, because that's our goal as a company. And so I think exactly what you just said, we need to understand, like, what is our company's, not only, like, I totally agree, the metric of quality or the bar of quality on the model, but then also, like, what actually is our goal? And it might not be to create, more of the same. It might actually be, our job could be creating a model that diversifies the availability of options to people that might be only looking for, rather, like in a recommendations engine. Maybe our job is to add recommendations that you wouldn't see, that your friends didn't buy. So what's our responsibility and role in that?
Yeah, and those can be really hard conversations to have with leadership if they, they may think that they need to have some sort of technical expertise and how that shows up in the model, as opposed to just having the design conversations about just the example you just gave, like the question, should we be sending our listeners more of the same?
Right.
That's not a technical question. That's
right.
just, should we be doing that?
Yep. Yeah, and it's actually, it's super inspiring, because I was like, oh, I should do like a series of content for like leadership around just this, like AI. It's actually more so and even more important now for these non-technical conversations to happen. One of my favorite data scientists is sociologist by profession. And it's so helpful because it, how we want our AI to, of course, think like humans, but then not so much. So it really, a lot of the questions we need to ask early in the process is less of, it's more about like, what are our values and what do we, what's our intention, and less about like what type of classifier we're going to use, or, what model are we going to build.
Yeah, it's interesting you were talking about explainable AI as well, because we're starting to see more use of techniques that are not so explainable. Like in the financial industry, there is a huge regulatory requirement for them to be able to kind of audit and report out on why they made certain decisions on whether or not people got loans or whether or not people were accepted at a certain credit limit, for example. And so can you give maybe the listeners a better understanding of what it means to have a model be explainable?
Yeah, so I think the biggest, or in my opinion, the most important thing is that if you are not, like, let's look at the reverse, right? If you have a model that you've built and you cannot tell how it's making its decisions, this is less useful in like a simple classifier, right? Or a binary classifier or something. It becomes much more challenging as we move into deep learning and neural networks, right? Where decisions are being made on top of decisions. And so explainability, and that's why I said I didn't want to promote any specific product, but as you get into these neural nets that make thousands of decisions, upon thousands of decisions, thousands of decisions upon thousands of decisions, it gets very difficult to, with your eyes, see the path that those decisions took and what conditions had to be in place for each decision to be made. So explainability allows you, especially as you get into these more complex decisions, and I say that's why I say make every model explainable, because it's good practice just to start with a very simple model and say, this is how this decision is made. Create muscle memory around explaining every single decision. But it's really when they get complex and nested that we lose sight of, like, wait, how did you get there from here, right? How did you make a decision? Very commonly facial recognition, right? How did you get that, a CEO looks this way? And if you use a neural net to get there, that path is not linear. And that's the whole idea. So as our decision making within our models expands beyond linear decision making, it's going to be very difficult for anyone to be able to not only for inner, like the ability to explain it just so I understand it, but also so that you can prove to someone that you're making a good decision and that it's reliant on like good, unbiased, or at least diversified data. So one thing I'll mention to you along the lines of the financial industry, I've talked to lots of CEOs about the implementation and use of, 100 CEOs will say, on the implementation and use of AI. And one of the biggest resistance, like methods of resistance or voices of resistance has been around the idea of like, I cannot tell my shareholders, stakeholders, board members, if I can't explain to them, how this model will work, it's a huge liability to the company, right? And that's what ultimately the banking industry is saying, is that you cannot have a liability of a model being able to haphazardly make a decision based on a variable you weren't aware of, right? Or based on, especially now that we're doing feature engineering, or I should say, we should be doing feature engineering. That's not a requirement, right? That's part of your quality bar. If you do feature engineering, your model selection will be better, and you probably will end up creating a more explainable model, but not necessarily. And because we have no industry standards, no industry guidelines that say, here's what a good model looks like that accommodates these principles, we've got a bunch of different consortiums kind of battling it out right now. But because that's not consistent, every company will do it differently. So I think it's multiple levels. One is creating a model that you can actually tell or describe every decision that's been made, but then also create a mechanism for reducing or mitigating the liability of what happens when that decision, is made and it's wrong. Because in an explainable model, the nice thing is every wrong decision, you should be able to go, oh, I know why that's wrong. And guess what I can do? I can fix it. I can go in and go, oh, this variable is the problem. Let me fix this. Let me train it with more data. Without that explainability, though, it's a black box, and it should never be a black box to us, the developers, right? Like, but that's how it is, and that's why I think you were alluding to, like, a lot of models, especially as we move into democratized models, we're leveraging models we can't even see what's going on inside. And that can
there's
be
more and more abstraction that's kind of to make it more available. And so, yeah, you do get into a rather risky scenario there. I mean, it's why these financial companies have a chief risk officer, right? And their job is literally to make sure that they are mitigating risk as much as possible. And
that's right. Yeah, and those are the ones who will shoot down the use of most artificial intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, if you were to, I know that you had mentioned there were a couple of standards kind of battling it out. I don't know if you can reference any of them or if you have some ideas on the topics that they're touching on, but what does model quality look like for you? Like what's the checklist for you and your teams to like say, yeah, this model's ready for production. We've done these 5 things, or you know, we've checked the boxes here. What does that look like?
Yeah, so one of the things I'll disclaim it with, my experience is in big tech companies, so this isn't going to be applicable to everyone. But there are some things that are shared, and the reason I joined Microsoft back in the day was because I liked their disclosure of the way that they were thinking about how to like model quality. And so one of the organizations that I closely monitor for, I'd say, generic, general purpose AI is Partnerships on AI. So partnerships, I think it's like partnershipsonai.com or partnershipsonai.org. Maybe they both go to the same place. Or you can just Google it or Bing it, I guess. But in that organization, I was part of that when it first got launched. So it started off with just a list of tenets, promises we would make to ourselves as individual contributors within our organization that we wouldn't let slide, right? Like that we would stand up for. And so part of them was transparency. Part of them was user-driven focus, right? So building models that actually had user data that showed that the model, the type of question that was being asked was driven by users who needed that solution. One thing that we found was many times a business's agenda will drive the development of model, right? Like we want to get rid of customer churn and we want to, get rid of fraud. And as we start thinking about what's the right model to build, it goes back to asking different questions at the beginning. And so one of those different questions for us anyway was like, oh, we don't want to start with already answering the question, which is, all right, I want customer churn is the problem. When actually in our case, it turned out customer churn was a symptom of a much larger problem. And how could we use AI to augment, in my mind, improve the ingenuity of the people that were interacting with our customers? So I got very interested over the last year in like customer service and chatbots and voice AI, like conversational AI, because that actually was what was the missing link. Was there was so much friction between the customer and our technology trying to help them that natural language element really improved the customer churn problem. So it ended up being a model, but not the model they wanted, right? Like the leadership had already kind of in their mind gone, this is what we need to build. And going back and making it a philosophy to be user-centric in your approach to model development or data collection or even analysis as early in the process as possible, I think is important. At Amazon, they call it customer obsessed. I think I've heard different people name it different things, but really it's just if you don't have a demographic of people saying that they need something or showing that they need something, what are you building and who are you building it for? And I'm a big believer of like, that's where we win, is when we help individuals. The other thing though is really around what I call inclusive engineering. How do we make sure that when even if we have, like, let's say this is gonna help everyone with diabetes, right? Like that's the product we're building. And that's a demographic that we're solving. I still am a believer that our model should take into account, like, what is the problem that we solved as a result of this specific constituency? And how do we make sure that there are other people at the table that could maybe help us evolve even ever so slightly the scope of that work to help more people in less time. Because I don't think a lot of us have time or resources in our projects to think beyond the scope of the very specific thing we're building. And sometimes we're building very, very siloed work. But what happens if I look at, a model that the finance team is building, and I'm like, oh, we could totally use that to manage our servers right over here. It's a very similar business problem, different stakeholders, different, data, but the actual model itself could be beneficial. And so having that more holistic view, I think, is really important, but it's a technical holistic view. And I think that's what, because oftentimes strategy is kind of seen to be an executive non-technical role, but I think that there's a big opportunity for technical leadership to say, what are all the problems within an organization or within an industry, and how do we solve that? Or how do we at least be empathetic to those as we're building these more siloed solutions?
Yeah, it's really interesting you mentioned reusability of some of these assets that are being created, because you're starting to see like leaders in the analytics field who are like, okay, how do we make this process a little bit more efficient? We spent so much time and energy in building this model. Can it be used for other things?
Yeah.
Is there kind of a word of caution or an evaluation process that you would emphasize around that on, will this have bad implications potentially if we use it for a different purpose?
And the interesting thing, I think, is that even just asking that question would be different than what I've never asked that question ever. When I built something, like, I don't know if it's like the elephant in the room, but I've never had us sit down right before we did something and been like, so what's the super unhappy path? What's the Black Mirror path of this technology, right? What would happen if we actually asked that question and then mitigated that? Now, I do know since I've left Microsoft that's a big, I wouldn't say that they're like doomsday planning, but they are asking better questions. And to kind of tie that into your question about like the checklist, one of those things is very tactically, when we were deploying a model, you would have to check a checkbox. You, individual deployer of model, would have to check a checkbox saying that you thought through the ethical implications of that model. But in my mind, it's a little unfair, right? Because all that does, it creates a scapegoat, right? It creates this one individual who's now responsible for like the ethical reliability of this model. And if it's not, that person's probably going to get fired. I don't know. It's a step. That's why I said I come from a big tech company, so that's how they chose to solve it. I don't know if I would choose to do it that way, but I do like the idea of just asking those questions earlier. So in our Hacker U programs that we're building, especially in the data science curriculum, we don't want ethics to be like this raisin in a bun, right? That you like stick on, it's course 15 and you'll get 2 hours of it. And we want it to be part of every conversation as you learn statistics, probability, R, Python. Like, you are thinking ethics becomes the first question to pop into your mind, or in our case, explainability, or what is the technology ultimately going to possibly be used for? Because the reality is that once we build that model, it's almost like you have really no control over how that's going to be used by your company or by anyone else if you make it open source. So how can you maybe be at least a little bit more aware of what you're doing and how you're doing it?
What's interesting too is I often find, at least in my experience, I used to work with a lot of data scientists that were consultants. And so we would meet with, organizations and they would already have a really well-defined thing about what problem they are trying to solve with this model, right? And so we often don't involve data scientists in that process of how is this being inserted into an overall business process, or how is this, what kind of implications could this have? That product mentality of who is this serving, like who's engaging with this. And so have you seen any, best practices around involving data scientists or analysts in that process specifically?
I think it also, because it's an interesting world that we're in, that we are taking something that used to be research and development focused and productizing it, right? And putting it into like mainstream software engineering organizations. Most companies are going to struggle with that. And so even the way that we think and we talk, or I should say, as an engineer versus a data scientist, like it's different. Like, it comes from a different world. I also say for those companies that are building AI now as products that used to just build software products, like there's some nuances to the way that an AI project is built. Like it's an experiment for the most part until it's not. And you also might never build a model that works. So I think because of those inherent challenges of just, it's not the same type of work that most companies have been doing, even if they had software engineering teams, that it requires, as I like, I'll say agile. I like the concept of agile, the methodology of agile. I won't say like very, like religiously, philosophically, all agile things, all ceremonies. But I will say the idea of creating autonomous teams that include all the players at the very beginning, and everyone, like all those stakeholders are involved at every phase. It introduces a data scientist earlier, because the data scientist is often almost at the tail end, right? Once we've already done data collection, once we've already done pre-processing, cleaning, and oftentimes we're like, good, here's your data set, thank you. And again, this comes from big machine, big organizations that kind of have this workflow. But if that is the case, you don't, by the time you get the data, you don't have a whole lot of information about how that work was done. And so I feel like creating these smaller autonomous teams where that data scientist is part of the requirements gathering phase, part of the design phase, part of the data collection and ingestion and infrastructure selection, not necessarily to make decisions, but just to create context. So by the time they get to the point where they're building a model or selecting a model, they can make a much better decision having known all the steps that came before it.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. It's interesting seeing a lot of these kind of software development practices try to be applied to data science and AI. There's some overlap. I mean, you can reuse a lot of those concepts, but it's very different in a lot of ways. And so I often see a lot of organizations using prototypes in production systems. Like, please, hey, you gave me this predictive thing and just run it every month on your laptop and then give me the outputs.
Yeah. I started a long time ago, but when I got to this point where I noticed my code was being used in production, I would put like this huge disclaimer, like do not use in production, like in comments, right? And I'd use all fancy characters, so it was like really big. And it was funny because they would run it anyway. Like they'd see my warning, or maybe they just, I don't know. But yeah, it is, the nature of our work is different than what they're used to. And so that's again part of the advocacy. Like, how do we say something about that? And how do we provide a little bit of guardrails? Because ultimately those things could be wrong, or they could have something wrong in them that won't show up until the 180th time that we run it. And we're now liable for that. And it's running in production, eventually impacting customers. It's just, I try to protect my data scientists. And I'm like, we have to do a better job of not allowing their work to be distributed just because it's awesome, exciting, and it seems fast. The results seem fast, even though potentially there's a lot of variability in that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I started seeing this term of productionizing models change by definition. Productionizing models used to be like put it on a production, server and run it against production data. But now it's really like putting it on a production server, productionizing data, and letting your customer see the outcome of that.
Yes, and that there's not really a very clear workflow of how that would be validated prior to it going live, if you will. And I'll give you an example for facial recognition, right? There was so much good happening with facial recognition software and algorithms that IBM, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, they all got excited, all started building, and all started releasing their models to the public for public consumption. And only when, a group of researchers went in and looked at it, realized they had huge problems in those models. And mostly because the people that they were testing it with were the same kind of people, homogeneous in nature, that were the ones building it. So they never, this entire time, they had models in production that were horribly bad, not making good decisions whatsoever. And then when that data became available saying that those models were making bad decisions, instead of going, oh, let's take a step back and pull it back, they literally just stopped, they quit. They're like, we're done. Facial recognition is bad. Again, attributing the badness to the tech instead of actually going, you know what, if we spend a little bit more money, resources, and time, we can go back and train this model the right way, include people in the review process, have a review process for before we actually release it to the public.
Right, this can be fixed.
This can be fixed. That's what I always say. I'm like, this can be fixed. We can fix this. It's not the tech that's bad. The tech is good. We need better people processes of how do we, like you said, wouldn't it be great if we all had like an AI manifesto that says, here's what our model quality bar is, and everyone has to have some kind of a scorecard that, like, you literally a checklist of here's the questions we asked and here were the answers we came up with. I do actually think that there might be a beauty in just asking the question. It's like the Heisenberg principle, right? Just asking the question is going to shift the way we would have built it had we not asked that question. Even if we do nothing specific on top of that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I want to, there's an audience question that I think dovetails perfectly into that, which is what can corporations do to make progress on inclusion?
Yes. So the first thing I would say is corporations, and I'll just say like senior leadership within a company, needs to be willing to wait. Time is always I found a lot of hiring managers, a lot of leadership that wants to build a team. They want to build that team very quickly. And that time is a factor in deciding whether or not they move forward with something. And unfortunately, when you combine something like a research project, like artificial intelligence in general, into productization, that timeline now gets slapped onto something that was not, the whole goal of research is not to be time-based, right? It's to be quality-based. Let's make sure we answer the right question and get the right answer, as opposed to we'll iterate, right? We'll push out whatever it is and we'll iterate on the bugs. That's not how we're supposed to do it. So I say corporations first need to educate their leadership team that they need to wait for the right team to show up. Like, they need to search for them. But the reality is we might even need to train them. Here is a sad truth that I noticed as I was hiring people, is that because the inclusion or lack of inclusion is so systemic, that people that I need in mid-career, they're not in mid-career roles because they were never given the opportunity earlier in their career. So when I look at my sea of candidates, I don't see anyone that I want, like, that is diverse, either ethnically, gender, even to special needs. I always think about like people with physical disabilities. How is it possible that I've never worked with somebody with physical disabilities when they're 1 in 5 people in this country? How is that possible? And it's because like this gate, right? So so now I have to, as a leader, think, am I willing to hire somebody maybe who is in the same timeline of their career, but doesn't have all of the things that others got? Right? Didn't get that promotion, so I do this is what I do. I look at a resume a little bit, but I'm actually looking for functional awareness. Show me your GitHub repo, show me what you've built, show me the work that you've done. And I now have to, as a leader, change the way I hire. But inclusion, one part of inclusion is changing your hiring practices and being willing to wait. If you have 5 roles, you need to say like half of those need to be different voices. They can't all be the same voice. And then the other thing, though, on top of that, is having an advocate inside the company. And maybe another word is champion. But like in Microsoft, Harry Shum, who is I think he's the executive vice president over all of research and development. He was an advocate for inclusion, an advocate for doing things the right way, for ethics, for making sure that when we built something that we protected it from being used in a way that we didn't want it to be used. And he was like, if you need to pull the chain on something because it's not right, you call me, right? And ultimately, corporations need to empower an individual like that who's in engineering, doing the engineering work, that can pull the plug on things. Because what I have found is by the time I need to pull the plug on something, I'm in a room of people who are driven by an agenda that doesn't fully appreciate my ethical concerns. And so I feel like the more we can create leadership roles that are like technical leadership roles that can say, no, for real, do not deploy this until we've had a chance to fix what's broken. Because once it gets to a certain point, it's kind of like, right, like the train has left the station. You can't stop it. It's gone.
Especially with all the pressure that organizations are getting from You know, they're higher ups on get this
Yes.
thing out the door. We need it on a
Yes.
timeline. We need to see progress. So
Yes.
I totally agree with you. I think it starts with educating at that level.
Yep.
And,
Yeah, and so honestly, that's why I created the AI Leadership Institute, was to just, and I right now I just go to like C-level executive boardrooms, and I'm just like, this. I can't even right now talk about the level we're at, right? I just need them to understand what being data driven means, what collecting the right data looks like, what, making sure that your team, even if it's a homogeneous team of people that look all the same, at least they need to be empathetic to the fact that your data can't be homogeneous, right? So so I feel like there's just a sea of work that needs to be done in the non-technical world to bridge them to where we are, so they understand why we think this is important, why it's, so that we don't get to another facial recognition stage where we launch something and then have to pull it back.
And then scrap it. Right.
Oh, no. Yeah.
No, thank you so much for being with us today.
Really
seriously, your background and your experiences are invaluable, and we, I really appreciate you being here and sharing them with us. I could literally talk to you for hours on this topic.
It's so fun. That's why I'm like, all right, we get to network and I get to talk to other people. But yeah.
So speaking of networking, I posted the link in the chat. If you click it, it's going to take you right out of here. So we'll see you over in the networking session. That way we can all hear each other, see each other, and talk about this topic a little bit more. So hopefully we'll see you all there. Noelle, thank you again. And I hope we see all of you in our next event in 2 weeks as well.
Sounds great. Thank you, everybody.